afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I know you're coming in right now, so we really appreciate you joining us today for Building Black Business Success Through Disability Hiring. I'm Elisa Joseph, Vice President of the U.S. Black Chambers, Inc., and I'm very pleased to host this session. Really excited about this session today. At USBC, we want to ensure that every opportunity for our businesses, regardless of size, to realize your business growth, from our largest companies in the USBC President Circle to our smaller companies, we see the ability to expand your business using strategies to get access to capital, contracting opportunities, and often present and discuss hiring and resource deployment to advance your business growth. Our guest presenter today is going to provide insights and guidance to explore why considering people with disabilities, an untapped pool of unskilled and dedicated workers in your recruitment efforts, is a savvy business decision. As part of our conversation, we will explore the diverse talents and abilities people with disabilities bring to the workplace, simple steps to make your hiring practices more inclusive, and resources available to support you along the way. So you will see some resources come up within the Q&A and the chat for you to be able to grab and to use moving forward. USBC represents over 160 Black Chambers of Commerce and small businesses, and we're founded on 5 pillars of service: advocacy, access to capital, contracting, entrepreneurial training, and chamber development. And so this series was crafted in collaboration, not only with our chambers of commerce that provide technical assistance to resources across the U.S., but also with the U.S. Small Business Administration's Community Navigator Pilot Program. Today, we welcome this discussion on building Black business success through disability hiring with Dr. Ashley Bryant, who's with the U.S. Department of Labor's Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, or EARN. I do want to encourage you, before I do a formal introduction of our speaker, to drop your questions into the Q&A, and we will, use those and address them afterwards. So thank you again so much for joining us. And right now, I'd love to introduce our presenter today. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker, Ashley Bryant, PhD, CRC Extension Associate for the Yang Tang Institute on Employment and Disability in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. As a Workplace Disability Inclusion Associate, Dr. Bryant supports the USDOL's ODEP, or ODEP-funded National Employer Policy Research and TA Center, which again is EARN, the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, through a grant to operate an employer-focused disability policy, development, and technical assistance center. Dr. Bryant is passionate about workplace inclusion, and she has a wealth of experience as a rehabilitation counselor to ensure persons with disabilities are included in the workforce. She's educated and received her doctorate at the Oklahoma State University Workforce and Adult Education. And so I'd love to welcome Dr. Bryant to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Like Alyssa said, my name is Ashley Bryant, and for a visual description, I am a Black female with long, dark braids wearing a purple blazer. You may note throughout the presentation, I'll be describing images, and that is to accommodate any of our audience members who may have a visual impairment.
And that's what's so exciting about this presentation, because it gives us an opportunity to really explore ADA in a new way and to give us all language, which is why we really wanted to do this today, because we typically don't have the language or understand what it is we should focus on or not focus on. So please take pointers as we go through this discussion and as Dr. Bryant presents this presentation. So to get us started, I'd love to start out with 2 questions for you. Just on a basic level, what is EARN, and why is it important to have an understanding of the disabled workforce as a small business owner?
So EARN, we are a technical assistance agency, and so EARN stands for the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. And what we do is we offer information and resources to help employers recruit, hire, retain, and advance people with disabilities, build inclusive workplace culture, and meet the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility goals within organizations.
And as a community of diverse types of business ownership that are on this call today, how crucial is it to identify financial resources to support Black small businesses or disabled entrepreneurs in making their workplaces more disability inclusive?
Yeah, we're actually going to share some of those resources that are available in the presentation today, but it is crucial because we know part of the barriers as small business owners and as Black entrepreneurs is our financial resources. And that's one of the common reasons why specifically Black businesses don't survive is because of those financial resources. And so we want to make sure that we are tapping into some resources that we may be unfamiliar with in regarding the inclusion of people with disabilities and supporting our businesses. And so I'm definitely going to share some of those resources with the audience today.
Well, I am going to turn this over to you. Again, really excited to hear this presentation. I know you all are as well. So without further ado, Dr. Ashley Bryant.
All right, so we'll just move to the next slide. So before we jump into the presentation, I do want to take time to thank our funder, which is the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. We are grateful for the funding that comes to Cornell University to support these type of presentations. And the conversation that we're having today is not necessarily the views of the Department of Labor, but it is their funding that allows us to bring to you content like the presentation today. So next slide. So what are we going to learn today? We have a couple of objectives for today's presentation. First, we're going to learn about the diverse talents and abilities people with disabilities bring to the workplace. Then we're going to dive into some simple steps that you can take to make your hiring processes more inclusive. And then lastly, we're going to learn about some resources that can help you in your hiring practices. And next slide. So to learn about the diverse talents and abilities of people with disabilities, I want to share with you a story about a US-based company named Autonomy Works. Autonomy Works is a company who has made it their mission to include people with disabilities in their hiring process. So much so, their practices caught the attention of news reporter Anderson Cooper and the show 60 Minutes. So let's get into this story in the next slide. So in this image, it shows 5 people with autism that spoke to Anderson Cooper in a 60-minute special. So in the front row of the group photo, from left to right, we have Brennan Novak, Peter Mitchell, Eric Rowland, and in the back row from left to right, we have Brian Evans and Sarah Clayage. Now, at the time of this story, Eric, who is a person with autism, had a bachelor's degree in sociology, but had been unemployed for about 3 years before he was able to secure employment. And next slide. And this is where Dave Friedman came into the picture. In this image of 2 white males, Dave is situated to the right, and his autistic son, Matt, is on the left side of the image. Dave is the founder of Autonomy Works, and he came up with the idea of Autonomy Works when he was working as the head of marketing at Sears. And if you grew up when I grew up, you all know that during the 80s and 90s, Sears had a lot of print marketing. Next slide. And so a lot of their marketing took place in newspapers. And so, okay, so back to Dave. So Dave, he had this experience in print marketing, and he thought to himself that this is a job that his son could easily do. Because one of his superpowers was he had an extreme attention to detail. And in the next slide, we'll talk about why this is important. Next slide. This is important because you can understand that if an item in these print advertisements should be priced at $29.24, but is actually printed at $21.24, it can cost a company tens and thousands of dollars. So this was a very important role that Dave had at Sears of catching these mistakes. Next slide. So what Dave's company at Autonomy Works does is they monitor about 2,300 websites a month to make sure companies are putting out quality and accurate information. In the news segment with Anderson Cooper, Dave noted that one of the things that made them so successful was the extreme attention to detail that their employees had, which included about 32 people with autism. And with their assistance, they experienced a 90% reduction in product and pricing errors. And that's huge. Next slide. In the same segment, Kelly Greer, who is the U.S. chairwoman of Ernst & Young, said that hiring autistic employees had saved their company millions of dollars. She said that the employees, they looked at problems in a different way that allowed them to create algorithms to shortcut and automate processes. And this is also in alignment with a 2018 report published by Accenture that said companies that prioritize the inclusion of people with disabilities are 4 times more likely to outperform their competitors in shareholder returns and have on average a 28% return, double their net income, and 30% profit margins. And so this slide here just reiterates what we discussed in regards of higher revenue, higher income, and profit margins. But another thing I want to highlight is hiring people with disabilities result in reduced turnover. One study found that people with disabilities stay in jobs on average 4.26 months longer than people without disabilities. So what that does is that leads to avoided costs, and that means that that's more money that you don't have to spend on recruitment. Next slide. So it's pretty clear that it makes business sense to include people with disabilities in your hiring processes, but you're probably thinking to yourself, that's great and all, but how does this work for my small business? Well, next slide. Great question. Well, let's start off with some common hiring and retention misconceptions. Some small business owners may be thinking, I want to hire more people with disabilities, but my workers' comp costs will be higher if I hire more people with disabilities. Next slide. Well, that is actually false. The fact is there are no increases in workers' comp costs related to workers with disabilities, and this has been verified by a number of studies. Next slide. The next misconception is healthcare rates will be higher if I hire more people with disabilities. And next slide. That, my friends, is also false. So I want you to keep in mind that healthcare rates are not determined by the number of people with disabilities you have within your workforce, and people with disabilities are not inherently unwell people. So going into the next slide, we've talked about a couple of misconceptions regarding hiring people with disabilities. So we'll talk about some strategies for actually including people with disabilities in your inclusive hiring practices. So number one is we want to understand disability. We want to create an inclusive and welcoming workplace, offer reasonable accommodations, promote physical and technological accessibility, and recruit job seekers with disabilities. So understand disability. Let's start with a definition of disability. So for the purpose of this presentation, when I talk about disability, we're going to use the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability. And so the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And that includes things like walking, standing, speaking, or concentrating, including major bodily functions such as the immune system or digestive system. It also includes people who have had a history of such impairment, such as cancer that is currently in remission. And it includes people who are perceived by others as having such an impairment. And that can include a person who has scars from a severe burn. One important thing to keep in mind is not all disabilities can be seen. And so many disabilities are non-apparent, such as mental health impairments, lupus, autism, hearing loss. Those are all non-apparent disabilities. Next slide. So when you are in the application phase of the hiring process, some people with disabilities may not actually disclose that they have a disability. And here are a couple of reasons why. One, people with disabilities, they do have a legal right to not disclose their disability status. What we should know is that if an applicant believes in good faith that they can perform the essential functions of the job, even if they believe they will need an accommodation to do so, they technically are not lying if they choose not to disclose a disability during the hiring process. But now, if it is shown after the offer has been made that the applicant cannot perform the essential functions of the job when using a disability accommodation, the job offer can be withdrawn, but the offer cannot be withdrawn just because the employee needs an accommodation. And sometimes applicants, they may decide that they want to tell you about the disability. And in that case, let the applicant take the lead in deciding how much they want to discuss about their disability and accommodations that they may need if hired. And you can just politely thank the applicant for sharing this information, but avoid any type of discussion regarding their disability or their medical condition. And also do not make any notes in the applicant's personnel file related to their medical condition. Another thing to consider is if your business is a federal contractor, there are requirements under federal law, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 503, that requires you to track the number of applicants with disabilities. So there are two distinctions that needs to be made, whether it's self-disclosure or self-identification. And so self-disclosure happens when an applicant tells their manager or HR person that they have a disability because they need something during the application process or to be able to do their job differently. That is self-disclosure. Self-identification happens if a person with disability to comply with the federal requirements for federal contractors. And to do this, you can have applicants complete the voluntary self-identification of disability form, which is provided by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. And we'll have that form for you available in the chat if you fall under the umbrella of a federal contractor. Next slide. So when we have hired people with disabilities, we want to make sure that we're creating an inclusive and welcoming workplace that involves leading by example. The people within your organization will see the culture as one where the company is committed to inclusion. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to provide you with some specific strategies for creating an inclusive and welcoming workplace. So one general guideline and best practice for interacting with people with disabilities in the workplace is to introduce yourself to the person directly. Sometimes you may encounter an applicant or an employee that uses an interpreter or uses an assistant. So we want to make sure that we're talking directly to that person and not to the interpreter or the assistant. We also want to make sure that we're using inclusive language and we respect that people with disabilities may have different preferences. For example, some people may prefer the term disabled people, while other people may prefer the term people with disabilities. And so if there's ever a question about what the person prefers, just ask. You also want to learn about accessibility and make improvements in your business facilities, technologies, and processes before they arise. And we'll talk more about some resources to help you do this later on in the presentation. Another thing you want to do is offer reasonable accommodations. So an accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job or work environment that enables a person with a disability to apply or perform a job. Examples may include a flexible hours or for medical appointments or to accommodate an employee with cancer, or dimmable lights to accommodate an employee who may have a migraine condition. So I know you may be thinking, what about the cost of reasonable accommodations? So next slide. So when it comes to reasonable accommodations, There was a study conducted that showed about 50% of accommodations actually cost nothing. And in the same study, the employers who were providing reasonable accommodations, about 43% of them said that the accommodation was a one-time cost and it was on average less than $300. Next slide. So when it comes to offering reasonable accommodations, you want to make sure that the applicants are aware of the accommodations are available during the application process, when performing the essential functions of the position, and during the employment of equal benefits and privileges of the employment. Next slide. When it comes to providing accommodations, here are some basics. So accommodations, they must be an effective accommodation for the individual requesting them. They must only reduce employment-related barriers, and they must be where they're not requiring the use of personal devices. And individuals covered solely under the regarded as prong not entitled to accommodations. So, and also I want you to note that you can go above and beyond. So the employer is not prevented from providing extra accommodations. So a question that we get that comes up a lot is, what is reasonable when it comes to reasonable accommodations? Well, here's some examples of some reasonable accommodations. It could be making modifications to increase facility access. It could be job restructuring, flexible scheduling, acquiring new equipment, or providing qualified readers or interpreters, or even modification of an application or testing procedure and training materials. Next slide. Here are some examples of some things that are not reasonable. That includes eliminating essential job functions, lowering production standards that are applied to all employees, providing personal use items, changing an employer supervisor, excusing violations of uniformly applied conduct rules, and things that are going to cause undue hardship. So when it comes to reasonable accommodations, there are some things that you can ask, and there are also some things that you should ask. So job applicants, they do have a legal right to choose whether or not they disclose a disability to a hiring manager. And the only question that a manager can ask in that situation is, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a disability accommodation? And this answer is simply a yes or no question. It's not an invitation for them to discuss their possible accommodations. Applicants cannot be asked questions that will force them to disclose a disability, such as questions like, do you have a disability that will prevent you from doing this job? Are you taking any prescription medications? Will you need an accommodation in order to do this job? Or have you ever collected workers' comp? Those are no questions. So let's talk about what you should ask. Ask applicants with disabilities the same thing you would ask anyone else, and that is, how do you plan to be effective? This is a question you can ask any applicant, whether they have a disability or whether they don't. And as with any applicant, you want to begin with the essentials or the main functions of the job. For each essential job function, ask the applicant about their experience and their skills and that they would bring to the task and how they plan to be effective in performing the work. So if the applicant chooses to disclose their disability or have any accommodations requests, you want to just simply listen, but approach the conversation without any prior assumptions and make sure you just keep an open mind. So we touched on this a little bit earlier, but creating hiring and onboarding processes that are inclusive and accessible for people with disabilities involves physical accessibility. which is vital to ensure that people with disabilities can engage with your business. A simple, no or low cost way to make your workspace physically accessible could be removing furniture or any other obstacles from hallways, and providing adjustable lights or even quiet workspaces to allow individuals to have full access to the workspace. And then we have a resource that's available, the ADA National Network, that also can provide you with some more guidance on how to adopt your space to be more physical accessible. When it comes to technological accessibility, you want to create hiring and onboarding processes that are inclusive and accessible. And for small businesses, technology is one of the central drivers of productivity and success for all workers. And so, but when software apps, online documents, and other technological platforms are inaccessible, that can be very frustrating for employees, and it can really inhibit them from being able to do their jobs. So one of the resources is the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT. They offer some guidance and some information on accessible technology. When it comes to proactively recruiting job seekers, here are a couple of strategies that you can use. Establish partnerships, include inclusive messaging and effective outreach, and have accessible recruitment processes. And when we consider the types of partnerships, you can explore partnerships with higher education, so your local colleges and universities, your local workforce development centers. Also, your state vocational rehabilitation program is another great resource to connect with to find a talented pool of persons with disabilities, and community partnerships. So when it comes to inclusive messaging and effective outreach, I do have a couple of earned resources that I'm going to share with you. So we have a job descriptions, and that is a page that outlines the components of an inclusive job description and the role that they play in the employment of people with disabilities. We also have the encouraging applicants with disabilities, and that's a checklist that you can use when developing your job listing. It helps to ensure that job descriptions and announcements convey that your company is an inclusive and accessible place to work. We have the inclusive branding and messaging, and it is a page with strategies to ensure that you communicate a commitment to inclusion in all recruitment materials across all online platforms. And we also have the online recruitment of and outreach of people with disabilities, which is a fact sheet that contains research-based practices that may increase your chances of attracting job candidates with disabilities. Other resources that we have include ensuring accessibility in hiring in the hiring process, and that will just help you learn some strategies for your organization's hiring process. Accessibility and authentic interviews for candidates with disabilities is another resource. And then we have a resource available for you on interviews, and this is to ensure that your organization's interview process are inclusive of candidates with disabilities. So when it comes to the inclusive hiring practices, there are some financial resources that are available. And one of those includes a Work Opportunity Tax Credit, or WOTC. And in general, the WOTC is equal to 40% of up to $6,000 of wage paid to or incurred on behalf of an individual who is in their first year of employment, is certified as being a member of a targeted group, which would include persons with disabilities, and performs at least 400 hours of service to that employer. But you also want to make sure that you're checking with your tax advisor or your CPA, because this is definitely not tax advice. The Disabled Access Credit, it provides a non-refundable credit for small businesses that incur expenditures for the purpose of providing access to persons with disabilities. And so with this one, small businesses that earn $1 million or less, or had no more than 30 full-time employees in the previous year, can take advantage of this particular tax credit. And we have the form that's available for this tax credit in the chat as well. Another resource that you may not be available, that you may not know is available, is the Architectural Barrier Removal Tax Credit. And it encourages businesses of any size to remove architectural and transportation barriers to the mobility of people with disabilities and the elderly. And businesses can claim up to $15,000 a year of qualified expenses for items that normally must be capitalized. Another resource that can support your inclusive hiring practices is the Registered Apprenticeship Program, or RAPs. RAPs are structured training programs. Employers who sponsor an RAP may be eligible to receive financial supports and tax credits, and also tuition support may be available to the program candidates. Next slide. Another resource to support your inclusive practice hiring this one is not a financial resource, but this is a great resource, and it is the Job Accommodation Network. So if you're seeking to get more information on how to support an individual with disabilities, AskJan.org is a great place to begin. And you can search any condition, or you can browse the listed conditions. Next slide. It also provides information on the condition, about the condition, and the ADA, and accommodating employees with the condition are different information sectors that you can find on Ask Jan about specific conditions. Next slide. And it also provides you with some questions to consider, some accommodations, and some accommodation ideas, and some key accommodations. And I know that this information is super tiny. That's why we're putting this information for you in the chat, and then you'll also have the resources available afterwards. And then on the next slide, we just have a list of some additional EARN resources that we're going to provide for you to help you support your inclusion efforts. And then on the next slide, we're going to have a list available for you, some general resources as well to help support your inclusion efforts. All right, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
So thank you, Dr. Bryant. This was really, really great. This is why I was excited to have this discussion. Number one, it was really to really get an understanding of the American Disabilities Act and what it really encompasses. One of the things that jumped out for me, because as you were going through it and I was thinking about it, was pregnancy was always the first one that, back in my earlier part of my career, could be sort of a short-term disability piece, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously it was critical for women, became more critical for men later on, but more critical for women as they were being hired. What did it mean? And so I think most people are probably more aware of that situation than others. But just the bevy of the types of disabilities that we don't normally even think about,
right,
as disabilities. Can you just sort of highlight a few of that? Because I know we talked a little bit about cancer. I mean, as we think about the workplace, we have more and more people who may be going through chemotherapy, more and more people. So a lot of times we're thinking more wheelchair accessible or Braille accessible, but it really does factor into a lot of other areas.
Absolutely. And that's the thing about disability. We have what we call apparent disabilities, or things we can see. And then we have the non-apparent disabilities. And those are disabilities that aren't so obvious. Things like, diabetes, which is diabetes is the #1 cause of blindness. And so we have other impairments. Let's see. Of course, now I'm drawing a blank, but as far as like the non-visible mental health impairments, that is going to be considered as a disability as well. And if we really think about it, about 1 in 4 individuals have a disability, depending on what stats that you're looking at. And so we're looking at, these are people that we work with, these are people that we shop with, these are people we go to church with. And so if we look around, 1 in 4 are going to be affected by disability. So of course, this is going to be in the workplace as well.
So I've got one question I want to ask. Please put your questions in the chat because I really do think not only do we need to make ourselves more cognizant of the ADA regulation in and of itself, but really be more open to looking at not only disability but hiring around that and what that means, and that it doesn't have to be overly complicated or even overly tough in terms of accommodations. Dana Thompson asks, I find the question confusing. Can you do the job with or without an accommodation? It
Mhm.
sounds like the person is asking if you do or do not need an accommodation to do the job. Would it be acceptable to say before the question something like, please respond with a yes or no?
So the question, let me go back. So the question is, can you do the job with or without an accommodation? Is essentially saying, can you do the job? And if you can you do the job either with an accommodation or either without an accommodation? So it's not a yes or no where it's saying, can you do the job with an accommodation? Yes. Can you do the job without an accommodation? Yes. It's like whether you can you do the job and can you do the job either with or without an accommodation? So essentially what we're getting at is, can this person do the essential functions of the job even if they have to be provided with an accommodation to do the job?
Okay. I think we have it's more of a question. I think it's kind of a question and a comment as we're thinking about what also qualifies in this space of accommodation or disability. PTSD.
Yes. Short answer is yes.
The next question, in terms of getting slides to this lecture, after each one of our webinars, we always provide you with the slides that we have. We're also going to have a landing page um, that focuses specifically on this. It'll be part of our virtual resource desk. So you'll get information on that as follow-up information to this. So you definitely will be able to leverage a lot of the answers, questions and answers as part of this presentation, in addition to the recording. So just know that we also post our recordings on YouTube. So for those of you who are here, for those who may have come late, for those who may have registered and just have something else and they could not attend, you will always be able to view this presentation. So just want to make you aware of that. Do we have any other questions?
And
One of the
Alyssa, I
questions
love
I had was really related to, because I really made a point of asking this question to Earn as I started to become a little bit more aware of what disability inclusion meant. And it was around the tax credit piece. And while we're not giving you tax advice, a lot of times, for instance, whether we're talking about the elderly or whether we're talking about those who might need an accommodation to get into a building like a ramp, there is an expense usually involved with that, but it looks like there might also be accommodation in the form of tax credits to offset some of that. Can you just talk briefly about, not to necessarily go in detail, but one of the things I know is always in question is how much is this going to cost me?
mm. Yeah, when we're talking about are you talking about as far as the architecture? Well, let me start.
The architectural piece, the
Yes.
whether it's a computer, whatever that equipment might be.
Yeah. So the architectural piece of it, the tax credit is the architectural barrier removal tax deduction. And we can drop that in the chat again. But the accommodation piece, whether we're talking about technology or whatever the accommodation in general, it's really going to vary from person to person depending on what they need in order to be able to do their job. But what we do know is most accommodations cost less than between $300 to $500, and that's a one-time expense. So most accommodations are really inexpensive. Like as far as like someone who has migraines, if we just put the lights on a dimmer to be able to dim the lights, that's a very low cost accommodation. Or providing a flexible work environment, that's a no cost situation. So when you hear about accommodations, I don't want you to think that, oh my gosh, this is going to be a very costly thing. A lot of times it's not costly at all to the organization.
I know somebody may have their hand up. Can you put your question in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A, so that we can answer it? The other thing I want to ask you is what made you interested in this area of workforce?
This is an interesting question. Well, a long time ago, Alyssa. No, no, honestly, I've been in the disability space for over a decade now. And as far as being on the employer side and being an employer myself, so I have a small business and we've been in business for since 2015. And being on the side where we're training the employers, I think when we talk about inclusiveness with people with disabilities, it's really because there's a lot of misconceptions out there regarding the hiring of people with disabilities. And so if I can help break down some of those myths, break down some of those misconceptions, we can live and work in a society where everybody is included. And when everybody is included, we all reap the benefits of it. We saw the statistics that people with disabilities, they stay longer on jobs than people without disabilities. And as employers, you know that it costs a lot of money to recruit talent and to recruit good talent. So when we get good talent, we want to keep them around. And so it's really been a joy to be on this side of helping other employers and other entrepreneurs be successful in their business by having and retaining top talent.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we're doing this is we're also trying to help small business owners who we all know how hard it is to find really good talent. And so this is sort of another area of recruitment that we may not have thought about. Resources or going after resources that we may not have been aware of to really find the right fit for our companies and to really find the right people. And so that's why we really want everybody to really be thinking about this as an option. Another question from Charles Ankrum. What if your business is providing for disabled personnel, i.e. a taxi service? Is that I guess eligible for credit via some of the IRS tax credit provisions?
That will be something that you will want to talk to a qualified tax professional, and I am not that person.
Okay.
But definitely, I would encourage you to ask these questions to you, the person, to your qualified tax professional, because if the resources are out there and it's something that you can take advantage of, definitely, it doesn't hurt to go with a list of questions and ask them all of the questions, especially related to any type of credits or any type of deductions.
And so in closing, I know we've got a couple of slides from you. Um, we don't have any more questions at this point, but I would encourage you all to please reach out to us if you have additional questions after this webinar. As I said, you are going to get the presentation. You'll also have the opportunity to review this multiple times. And again, it just sort of, we'll have a landing page as well with a lot of these resources in it. So is there anything that you want to add in closing? I know we have a couple more slides, I think.
Yeah, I want everyone to know that the Employer Assisted Resource Network, we are a resource for you. We are a resource for employers to help you with your disability inclusion efforts, and we are a resource at no charge. So you can look on our website. You can capture all of the resources that we're going to provide afterwards. You can peruse the website. We have a small business checklist as well, a toolkit that we're going to provide for you in the resources as well. And so if you scan this QR code here, it's going to take you to our website where you can learn information and engage with us on social media as well. We are definitely here to serve you.
And I'd also, ask you all to share, with your colleagues as well and other business owners that you know. And just know that we'll have those resources, so this will always be a place to come back to. Thank you, Dr. Bryant. We so appreciate your commitment and dedication to this work and spending some time with us, clearing up any misnomers we may have about hiring in the disability sector and how it really is going to benefit our businesses in the long run. So we really do appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And then we just have a couple of closing slides as it relates to USBC. You can scan the QR codes that you saw on the previous slide, as well as this slide, to give us feedback on our session today. We also have a lot of resources within our resource desk at usblackchambers.org, so please visit that. I think we have another slide after this. Would love for you all to onboard your businesses, if you have not already, into Buy Black, so that as a Black-owned business, you are able to be found nationally. You may also certify your business with Buy Black. You literally only have to be in business for a year for this certification. It's all done online, and a very really easy and simple process. Our next slide, I think we also have a couple of other resources, some future events coming up. We have a informational session on Buy Black on June 5th, June 12th through 13th. If you are already part of our matchmaking session, that will be held on June 12th and the 13th. And then our national conference. We invite all of you to attend our national conference in Washington, D.C. at the Waldorf Astoria, July 17th through the 19th. We do have conference-only passes. We have full conference passes. We have a gala ticket available for purchase. So when you get our follow-up email to this, we will share those links with you as well. And as always, we just want to always thank you for joining us, for taking time out of your day to be able to learn something new, find a new resource that you can use for your business and for your business growth. And so we're really thankful for you coming today. Please continue to follow us on social media at US Black Chambers, and follow us, and you can reach us at usblackchambers.org/webinars for upcoming opportunities. So just look out for our email, look out for the recording of this particular event shortly, and we thank you all so much for coming with us today. Have a great day.